for coming tonight. Next month we will have Maureen Neiman from the Department of Biology for our last seminar of the semester. We'll start again in September. So check our website for those speakers and titles, but I'll turn it over to Greg.
Great, thank you. Yeah, one of the nice things about working for the Park Service is that I get to go to a lot of parks, but even more fun is the fact that when I can keep my hands in paleontology, so working with the Denver Museum as a research associate has really allowed me to move away from being a bureaucrat for the government and get back to my intellectual and paleontological roots. And the Snowmass site is certainly a good example of being in the right place at the right time. For those of you who haven't spent any time in Colorado, this is the Snowmass Village area, and of course, as you can tell from the background there and the ski runs, that's what tends to attract most people in the winter time. And the golf course here, of course, is what they use for the off-season when you're not skiing. So this is what most people think of, that if you're going to go up to Snowmass Village, this is what you're heading up there for. And because it is a popular ski area, there have been a lot of seasonal housings put in for people who come up for the ski season and that, and it's been growing. And the village of Snowmass decided that they really needed to increase their water supply. And this was their water supply, and they decided that they really needed to enlarge its holding capacity. So they basically decided to contract to have part of this area excavated out, deepened, and enlarged in order to make sure that they could accommodate all their new residents. And of course, what's the best way to do this is you pull in a few bulldozers and start moving dirt around. And as you can see, that this is late in the fall. They wanted to get a good start on it. The contracting company was basically had a deadline they had to meet. And so they wanted to get going and get as much work done before the ski season started, because they still had to take sure that there was going to be a water supply in the temporary area, and they get this done. And so they were up against a very tight deadline. But fortunately, despite that tight deadline, the bulldozer operators noticed as they were bulldozing things like this showing up. And so they stopped what they were doing. They contacted the water managers, said, "You've got to come and see what we found." They contacted the Denver Museum, and they said, "We think you need to come up here and see what's showing up here." So we're very fortunate with these mammoth tusks showing up that this caught the attention of the construction crews, and they were willing to stop rather than just sort of push them aside and keep on going. Well, of course, as soon as you say mammoths in Colorado, this gentleman shows up. This was the curator of archaeology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Steve Holland, and he was very much interested in Paleo-Indians and mammoth hunting. And he's a good friend, so I can say this, but he was convinced, like most archaeologists, that mammoths only died by being killed by humans. And so, of course, what he was hoping for, checking out these mammoth bones that they found, was that perhaps there might be evidence of human involvement. And so they started doing excavating and working around just to get an idea of, is this just one small site, or how much material is actually preserved here at the site that they were uncovering. And it turns out that as they were excavating, up on the high part here, they found part of a mammoth skeleton. And so they put up a tent and a propane heater. Now, to me, that kind of takes away from the atmosphere of collecting, saying, "I collected a mammoth when there was snow on the ground." But they were also able to work longer hours and not freeze to death. So this was the initial excavations, but as you can see, they were bulldozing a very large area here, and so there was the potential that other material might show up. And once they started looking around, we were able to at least confirm, yes, this was an Ice Age site, even though we didn't actually find ice skates on any of the animals that we found. Now, when you think about it, when we think of the Ice Age, of course, we think of the huge continental glaciers, and certainly the Laurentide ice sheet here is what really gives us an idea of what the landscape should look like during an ice age. But you'll notice that even at their maximum extent, this big continental glacier did not get down into Colorado. But instead, what we had were southern extensions of the ice sheets that build up in the Rocky Mountains. So we have part of the Cordilleran ice sheet in Colorado, but not part of the large continental Laurentide ice sheet. So when we talk about the history of the Ice Age in Colorado, we're looking at it from a very different perspective than Iowa, in terms of where you actually had, a fair amount of ice come down into the state and have some impact on the local topography. So when we look at the Rocky Mountains, what we're really looking for are mountain glaciers. And so here's Snowmass Village here. Here is the Ziegler Reservoir, their water supply. And so we're looking north, and if you just go west, you'll notice all of these valleys here have the typical U-shaped cross-section indicative of glaciers. If you think of an unglaciated valley, it's pretty tight and V-shaped. Once you put the glaciers down it, it gouges it out and makes it U-shaped. And so we could basically see where all these different valleys, tongues of ice were coming together, joining, and then flowing down towards lower elevations. And I want you to pay particular attention to the fact that this ice had to make a fairly tight turn right here on this bend in the valley. So if you had been traveling in the Rocky Mountains, 130,000 years ago, a lot of the valleys would have looked a lot like this, basically filled up with ice coming down from various valleys, joining together, making bigger masses of ice, and continuing to flow down. And of course, you can see that the ice is plastic enough, it's pretty good at making turns, and of course, as it's doing that, it's grinding off rock, it's acting as a giant bulldozer on its own and modifying the landscape. So this is the type of glacial geology in Colorado we generally think about, what's up in the mountains, not down in the plains or the lower topography. And here's just another reconstruction of what it would have looked like about 130,000 years ago, what we call the Bull Lake glaciation. So this would have been the glacial period before the last interglacial, the Sangamonian, before the last glaciation, the Wisconsin. And so we have a different sets of terminology. We call it the Bull Lake glaciation for the Cordillerans and up in the Rocky Mountains. And once again, everything's not covered. Basically, you're talking about valley glaciers coming together and lobes coming down into the lower areas. And so it's, definitely the ice is there, but it's certainly different scale than what you find in the eastern United States. And right there is the Ziegler Reservoir site, and here is that turn I was talking about. And basically what happened is this valley filled up enough where the ice pushed over the edge and basically pushed some of this ground up rock, this moraine material, over the edge into a small little basin, and basically you had a big block of stagnant ice there. So that's the beginning of our story in terms of this fossil site, that 130,000 years ago, this ice pushed over and gouged out and basically created this basin that becomes this lake that we were using as the water supply for Snowmass Village, called Ziegler Reservoir. Well, I'm preaching to the choir here. I think everybody here in this room understands the fact that if you're excavating for bones, bulldozers are good for moving a lot of earth, but don't have quite the gentle touch you prefer to have. And so the Denver Museum put out a call for volunteers, and the call was answered. In fact, they were put in the embarrassing position of having more volunteers they could accommodate. Snowmass Village was very nice because most of the apartments there in the village, it wasn't ski season, they were empty. So they had all this housing to put up their volunteers. It is the plushest field work I have ever done. And basically they had to work people in shifts throughout the time. So basically what they did is they turned people loose with shovels, And as the bulldozers were working in one area, they would have monitors on either side walking along. If they saw something, they would stop them. The guy on the bulldozer would back off. They would go with the shovels, see what was there. The bulldozer would work in another area. So it wasn't quite the construction plan that they had planned on, but it was working. And the fact that they were working together as teams, where the bulldozers would work in one area, they would monitor, and when we were finished with an area, they would come back. There was basically ongoing progress to help the construction crew meet their deadline, but at the same time, the museum was able to map the bones and collect all the pertinent scientific data that was needed to not make this just a salvage operation, but actually make it, as much as we could within the constraints, a scientific excavation there. So one of the very nice things is that the Denver Museum has this phenomenal volunteer program. Many of them are involved with the Earth Science Department that I'm an adjunct with, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science actually has a paleontology certification program where these people take formal courses about taking field notes, about measuring bones in the field, learning the anatomy, the identification, the geology. So they come out, they have a really good understanding of what's expected of them to get out in the field and to be involved with these excavations. And believe me, once they started looking, there was not a problem with finding anything. This was not one little isolated site. This, dare I say, it was a bonanza. And of course, what's very interesting is, for those of you, this is a very familiar animal for this part of the world, a mastodon tooth. Up until the discovery of this site, there were only 3 records of mastodon known for Colorado. Now, in the eastern United States, we take it for granted that you're going to find a mastodon. When I was working for the Cincinnati Museum in Ohio, the saying was every peat bog had a mastodon. They were just so common. Get out to Colorado, it's an entirely different story. So the fact that they started finding mastodon in itself became very interesting. I'm really glad they found this site when they did, because just 3 months before, I had published a short paper on the 3rd discovery of mastodon in Colorado. We all thought it was a big deal. I'm glad I got it published before this came out, because suddenly, oh, just another mastodon, who cares? And that. But there was lots of mastodon in the site. So that was starting to tell us there was something different about this site, the fact that we were getting mastodon there. And lots of bones. This may look vaguely familiar. As you can see, we're not finding articulated skeletons. Obviously, there was time between when the animals died, a little bit of scattering the bones before they were preserved in the site there. But it was certainly one of those things that anybody who was spending time moving dirt with a shovel, hoping to find something, never went away disappointed. So it was turning out to be a phenomenally rich site. And just to show you how phenomenal this site is, our previous records of mastodon in the state consist of a couple of isolated teeth and the fragment of jaw with one tooth that I had described 2 months before. As you can see, the quality of the record has improved considerably, where they were getting complete skulls, lower jaws of mastodons from the site. In fact, we've got now 25 individuals from this one site. So it's just like, we've obviously found where the mastodons were hanging out all this time in Colorado. They were ski bums. And of course, what's really nice is that having that large a sample, we can start looking at populations. And mastodons, like modern elephants, with those big teeth, they can't get all their teeth in the jaw at one time, so they replace them in sequence. And so basically a tooth comes in, as it's moved forward, as it's worn down, eventually it's completely worn down, it falls out, another one comes in and replaces it. And so in each quadrant of the jaw, above and below, they go through 6 of these teeth through their lifetime. And this is the same thing that modern elephants do, so we can kind of look at the pattern of tooth replacement in modern elephants to come up with estimates of the age of our mastodons as well. And we can certainly tell this is the last tooth. This is number 6 here. So there's number 5. It's still got a ways to go to be completely worn down before it comes out, but we obviously had very old adults up there as part of our mastodon population at Snowmass. But here we have a happy person who found something, and it's a jaw of a baby mastodon. So one of the interesting questions we have is if we've got babies up here at this high elevation, did mastodons move up to the high country in the summer to high pasture and then move down into lower country somewhere in the wintertime? Was there a seasonal migration in elevation? Now, here in the eastern United States, where you don't have quite the extremes in elevation, maybe mastodons move north and south in migration seasonally depending on available vegetation. But here's a different idea of thinking about their ecology and natural history, that maybe they were moving up and down in elevation, or is it possible that they were living up there year-round, that they were finding enough food in the wintertime to survive? And so one of the ongoing questions, one of the ongoing research projects we have is to start maybe looking at stable isotopes in the teeth to see if there's a change in their diet. And one of the team members on this is Dan Fisher, who's been one of the leading experts on using the tusks of mastodons to interpret their ecology. And so he's come in and he's been sectioning tusks. And this is one of these, this is a gift that keeps on giving. This is a site that there's going to be papers coming out for a long time because there's so many interesting questions based on the animals that we're finding here. So just out of curiosity, for the fun of it, I went to the literature and spent a little bit of time looking at papers. And what I kind of did is looked at the relative number of records in the literature of mammoths and mastodons for each state where I could find the information. So the larger the circle, the larger the sample that I've got. The red is the percentage of the pie of mammoths and the green are mastodons. And I think there's a really neat pattern here where you look at the eastern United States, there's a lot more records of mastodon than mammoths, and once you get out onto the Great Plains, the mammoths tend to be very dominant. And I do have to increase the width of that little green sliver by a little bit to add in the Snowmass side. But this was a very interesting thing because we think about it, mastodons with their type of teeth are browsers. They're feeding in, they like spruce fir forests, whereas mammoths are more open country grassland grazers. And so we see that in the difference of the teeth. And certainly we know that during the Pleistocene, this area was much more heavily forested. And of course, the amount of forest cover thins out as you go west onto the Great Plains. There's a few records, but a lot of times we're finding these along river deposits, in gravel deposits. And we know that along the rivers, a lot of times you'll have gallery forests, which may have been attractive for the mastodons, but certainly the population sizes were smaller. And so now we start scratching our heads. Well, it suddenly makes sense that if mastodons like spruce forests, if you go to Colorado, where's the spruce forest? It's up in the mountains. It's not down on the plains. So the mastodons were hanging out at these high elevations. We just had never gotten a fossil site that had captured where their primary habitat was. So this raises the whole question of how many other Ziegler Reservoir Snowmass type sites are hiding out in hard to get to places in the Rocky Mountains. But it does show that there is the potential for some really phenomenal finds up there. And this site may be the tip of the proverbial iceberg. So here we have a nice reconstruction of the vegetation. And here we kind of have the reconstruction for the eastern United States. And if you match up the colors, there's all of our possible mastodon habitat during the Pleistocene. So one of the things we can start doing now is look at what the information the paleobotanists have put together from the pollen records, reconstructing the habitat distribution in the past, and then start seeing how well our discoveries, say, of mastodons matches up with that in terms of where those records are coming from. So once again, getting a site like this really gets us thinking of what types of stories are out there and how is it going to tweak or modify our understanding about the ecology of a lot of these neat Ice Age animals. And along with the mastodons, we did get mammoths. And some of you may not know, this is a U of I alumni, Russ Graham. I think that Holmes had a little interaction with him over the years as a collaborator. And Russ, of course, is Murphy's Law. Russ works with mammoths along with a lot of other animals. He had been the chief curator at the Denver Museum. He had left to take a job as director of the museum at Penn State. And a year later, guess what they find? The most phenomenal Pleistocene site in Colorado. So they didn't leave him out in the cold. They brought Russ back as part of the team. And that's what was really neat about this project. It was the ultimate interdisciplinary team where we were bringing in experts from all over to look at all components of the site. So here's Russ looking at the mammoth, and as you can see, the chewing surface of the mammoth here looks a lot different from that of the mastodon, designed with those ridges for breaking down abrasive grasses and food as opposed to chomping up leaves and twigs and browsing like the mastodon. And of course, when we say mammoth, I'm talking Columbian mammoth. I often find that as soon as I say mammoth, everybody wants to put woolly in front of it. And so we have the unwoolly mammoth, the Columbian mammoth, probably about as hairy as an African elephant or an Indian elephant today. It was a more southern mammoth. And this is the first mammoth skeleton that they found that the tent was over. And you can tell that the archaeologists excavated because they're very good at digging straight, square holes. Paleontologists don't do that quite as much. And here you can see the pelvis. Here are some of the ribs. Here's some other bones, a tusk coming up there. These are some rocks that were mixed in with it. And of course, this is what got our archaeologists very excited because perhaps these rocks were anvil stones that had been brought in by Paleo-Indians. So early in the excavations, suddenly there was this possibility that we had Paleo-Indian involvement. And so as he excavated this, he says, I don't want to take this out piece by piece. I want to study this intact. And we can't stay in a tent forever. So how are we going to get this back to the museum so we can excavate and look at this specimen in the detail it requires? Well, one of the nice things about working with a construction company is you've got access to toys in the field you don't normally have access to. And so they turned their volunteers loose and they dug around. So this is all of that mammoth skeleton you just saw in the previous excavation. And they dug under it and built one huge pallet to support it. And then they called in the construction folks. And so they loaded it up. Everybody's holding their breath as this thing floats through the air. And then they just swing it around and put it on the flatbed truck to take back to the museum. And that. This is the way you excavate mammoths. If you've got a construction crew in your backyard that you can call on all their heavy equipment there. Of course, there are certain logistical challenges above and beyond just getting it out of the ground, onto the truck, and back to the museum. For example, what happens when it's bigger than your freight elevator and you can't get it into your prep lab because the doors aren't wide enough? So what the museum did is they moved the jacket into the atrium and made a live preparation demonstration for visitors to come see. So here they are setting it up. They've reconstructed the grid system for mapping the bones, and they're taking off the plaster and very slowly removing the matrix and doing all the preparation that is required to get these bones out. And of course, the added advantage is that if you look at this specimen, you'll notice it was phenomenally fractured. This isn't a peat deposit high at the top of the layers that we had. And guess where they had parked a bulldozer? Directly on top of the mammoth. And so there was still about maybe a foot of peat where they parked it before they found it, but the pressure was enough to cause all this fracturing. So the advantage of taking it out like this was that with the preparation, they were able to take off the fragments, harden them, glue them back, and not turn it into a gazillion-piece jigsaw puzzle. Other surprises kept showing up. It was like getting spoiled. You just never knew what neat thing was going to show up next. This is the skull of the giant bison latifrons. And so here's the nose here, here's the eye here, the forehead. Latifrons means wide forehead. And then here's the horns going off. This is Dan Fisher, who was brought in to work on the mastodons and that. So he's slumming looking at the bison, but we let him. And that. And here is that same specimen prepped out at the museum. Prior to the discovery of Snowmass, we had one, maybe two possible records of the giant bison latifrons in Colorado. And these were based on fragments of horn cores. So just enough to be tantalizing, but not enough to really be informative except a dot on the map. And what's really neat is, again, not only did we get the adults, we got the juveniles as well. So here you can see the sutures haven't formed yet. So this is a juvenile bison latifrons. But to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here when I use the term giant bison, and of course everything in the Pleistocene was giant. It's one of those, the giant woolly saber-tooth whatever. We get carried away with the adjectives. But this one here, the tips of the horns are missing, got clipped off by the bulldozer. But if you put on the tips in that, between the tips of the bony cores of the horns, the largest individuals we know got 8 feet between the tips of the horns. This one's probably a runt. It's probably only about 6.5 feet between the tips of the horns. And generally, when we find remains of the giant bison, they're found as single individuals. We don't find herds of these animals. In fact, what was amazing is that we have 5 different individuals, adults and juveniles, from this one site. There's only one other site in the United States where multiple individuals had been found, and that happened to be southeast Idaho, where I did my undergraduate work. And that has the largest single collection of the giant bison anywhere. This is now the second largest sample of a single population from one area. So once again, you just never know what was going to show up at the site. And just to give you an idea of what it looked like, this is the viewable prep lab at the Denver Museum at the end of their exhibit hall prehistoric journey. And so you're looking at the back end of that bison. We got to add a little bit more of the tip here and on the other side. But you can imagine what it took to hold up a head with a horn span like that. The spines on the vertebrae are very tall and they're very thick, and there must have been a phenomenal ligament coming off the spines of the vertebrae, and you can see where it would have attached on the back of the skull there. Now, we don't think that these were herd animals. You probably would not have seen herds of thousands of individuals like we think of the plains bison milling around, but maybe extended family groups, 2 or 3 individuals, maybe solitary males. And the other thing to keep in mind, if you look at that skull there, is that they probably didn't ram heads. Those great nature shows of 2 big bull bison coming back and just going full bore at it. What we think they did with these horns is they hooked them together, and it was a test of strength of pushing back and forth to throw one down rather than the force of ramming heads together. And so what they did with this specimen before it was reassembled, the museum made arrangements with the local hospital and ran it through the CAT scan. So we have the first CAT scan of a bison latifront skull, and we're going to look at the internal structure and compare that to modern bison to just see how different this is in terms of their possible behavior between bulls going at each other. So once again, once we got into this site, everybody's imagination, we could do this, how can we do this? And so it's been a real intellectual ride with all these people coming in and exchanging ideas and thinking about what we can learn from this site. And just to kind of give you a feel, here is a distribution map of all the records of bison latifrons from a book done by Jerry McDonald, no relation, good friend, but not related, who worked on bison. The very first specimen of bison latifrons was found here in Kentucky, northern Kentucky, not too far from Cincinnati. But as you can see, it's been found into southern Mexico, Florida, and lots of good records here on the Great Plains. Here's southern Idaho, where the large number is known from. And of course, now we can add this extra dot for the Snowmass site, which, by the way, happens to be the highest elevation this animal's ever been found at. So it's starting to tell us something of these animals were a little bit more flexible on where they lived. They weren't all down on the plains. Perhaps the giant bison, like the mastodon, was migrating up to high pasture in the summer and then down to the low country in the winter. And we have historical records of bison doing that in Colorado in the past. And in fact, with the melting, with the warming and the melting of the ice sheets in the Rocky Mountains, we are now finding bison bones in these melting ice patches, where presumably the bison came up, they were being bothered by flies, for whatever reason they went into the ice patch and died there. So we've got lots of different bits of information coming together, and so it's very possible that bison latifrons also kind of did this seasonal migration. Well, I've named a lot of smart people who are involved with this project. You know, Russ Graham, Dan Fisher, you know, and then you're all looking here, well, why are you standing up here giving the talk, you know? So I actually did have a small contribution to make to the project, and that's because they found this bone here. And my wife called me, I was in a meeting, and I got this message, call your wife, it's not an emergency. She says, the phone's been going off the hook all day. They think they found a sloth at the Snowmass site. I said, oh, that's kind of neat. And they said, well, they want you up there right now. So I managed to run up over the weekend in that and confirm that, yes, this is a bone from a sloth. And of course, it happens to be a sloth you are all very familiar with, Megalonyx. And a total surprise, because previously we had found another sloth in Colorado out on the plains, Paramylodon. This was the first record of Megalonyx from Colorado. And Megalonyx was a forest animal, commonly found in sites like the mastodon. And the reason we hadn't found it previously is because it was also hanging up in the spruce forest in the Rocky Mountains, not down on the plains, because Paramylodon was an open country grassland form. They had different ecologies. And so we got very excited about that. Here is that first bone they found. It's the upper arm bone or humerus. I try always keep at least one humerus slide in my talk, so this is it. But along with that, we found a beautiful skull. And in fact, we not only got this adult, we've got the brain cases of two more juveniles. So different areas, very widely spread, probably accumulated at different times, but we got a lot of material of this skeleton, as well as parts of a couple of other ones from the site. So now we've added a whole new animal to the Pleistocene record of Colorado with the discovery of Megalonyx. And this made me very, very happy. I've spent a few years looking at Megalonyx. This is a distribution map that we put together for Megalonyx jeffersoni. And it's always bugged me that we had this donut hole. None in Wyoming, none in Colorado, none in New Mexico. And I thought, well, if they're on either side there, why don't we have any records in between? And that simply has been answered that they are probably there, but they're at high elevations where we rarely find sites. So they knew what they were doing. We just took us a little bit longer to catch up. So I've now got friends of mine in Wyoming saying, you got to find some high elevation sites so we can get some Megalonyx there. And I've got a friend down at the New Mexico Museum, and I said, he's currently excavating a high elevation site. So it's like, got a Megalonyx yet? Got a Megalonyx yet? Go away, I'm trying to dig. Got a Megalonyx yet? So we're waiting to see. So we are now changing our thinking, because once again, this is the highest elevation that Megalonyx has ever been found. And I'm a real glutton for data. I can never have too much data, you know. I'm always ready to travel 1,000 miles just to measure one more bone, because I always like to have more data. However, I found out that there is a little bit of problem like that. If you think about sloths, Modern tree sloths live in the tropics, and they're very shaggy. And that's because sloths have a low body temperature, they have a low metabolism, and whatever heat they generate, they don't want to lose. So even living in the tropics, they're very sensitive to cold temperatures, which is why they need that insulation. So I've often felt that maybe the fossil sloths had that similar limitation. So I've been very interested in how temperature might affect the distribution of fossil sloths. And so what I did is I looked at records for megalonyx from the last interglacial, Sangamonian, and also from the Wisconsinan. And one of the things we find that during the last interglacial, they went farther north, and they were going up in elevation there. And so it was like, oh, I've got a beautiful pattern. Look at that, you know. What are the two things that control temperature? Latitude and elevation. And I thought, man, I've just got, look at that line. That's just absolutely great. And then we found Snowmass. So now we've got to go back to the board, because obviously they were capable of even going higher in elevation during the last interglacial. So yeah, I want a lot more sites now to test this hypothesis, but it certainly does show that perhaps when climate was warmer, the sloth got as far north as the Yukon and Alaska during the last interglacial, and then when it started cooling with the glacial advance, we lost that northern population, and the northernmost edge of the population was at a lower latitude. But during the interglacials, they could also go up into higher elevations, but when it got too cold and glaciers started building up in the valleys, then we lost that part of their range as well. So it really starts giving us a feel of the dynamics of how these animals are responding to climate change in the past. Well, we often look at all these really neat exotic animals like the sloths and the mammoths and the mastodons and the giant bison, but this site had much more to give than that. We had a beautiful articulated skeleton of a deer that was found up in the peat deposits. Here it is looking, you can see the palate with the row of teeth. Notice the antlers there. I'll give you 3 guesses where somebody parked a bulldozer before we found this. We had some after they took this jacket out, we had some very dedicated volunteers that once again went through this whole jacket, taking all the little fragments, hardening it, and jigsawing it back together. And so it's probably very similar to a mule deer, which of course is in Colorado today, but there's some differences in the anatomy and the robustness of the bone, so it makes some kind of an interesting question as to, is this sort of an extinct subspecies or what's going on? So we found deer at the site. We got a token horse bone. This is our only horse we got from the site, part of the cannon bone from the middle toe, where the middle toe attaches at. But at least it gives us a little idea of the diversity. And we got 1 camel tooth. Now, this extinct camel, Camelops, had been found in Colorado before, so it was no surprise. But once again, at this high elevation, because all the previous records were out on the Great Plains and the Low Country. So here is another very interesting record in terms of animals living at higher elevations than we had previously suspected. So it really does reinforce the idea that there's probably lots of potential of high elevation sites in the Rocky Mountains like this that, if found and can be excavated, are really going to change some of our thinking about the ecology of many of these extinct forms. And just to kind of show it to you, here is a distribution map of Camelops. You can see it's a western species, and there's our Snowmass record right there. So no big surprise in terms of overall geography, very big surprise in terms of the elevation at which we'd found it. And just to give you an idea of how dense the bones were, one of the nice things was they set up a tripod. Every bone before it was taken out was shot in. It was mapped orientation. So we did quite a bit of taphonomy on the site. And we've got about 15 meters of stratigraphy. So while we're looking down at this cloud of bones, they're not all in one layer. This is a condensed view looking from the top down of bones that were spread over 15 meters of stratigraphic interval. And these are just the big animals. So there's about 5,000 bones from the mammoths, the mastodon, the bison, the sloth, all of the big animals that were found there. So, and this represents about 10% of the total Pleistocene lake. So the area that here is what was excavated under contract in order to increase the water supply, but there's 90% of the deposit that is untouched, that's still available for excavation in the future. And the museum has a standing invitation to come back up anytime they want and renew their excavations. But of course, as you know, working in the museum, once you collect it, you got to clean it. And they're still cleaning and curating. So it's going to be a while before the museum is ready to go out and take on another project like this, because they're still trying to get caught up. Now, I know Holmes is sitting there and going, where's the small stuff? Phooey on this megafauna. And we did pay attention to the micro animals as well. So bulk sediment samples were collected, it was screen washed, and then of course that famous pastime of with magnifying lenses, looking around, seeing what's there, and it was, some of the layers were quite rich. The small animals were present. So here is a selection, but this was an ancient lake. And as an ancient lake, it had animals living in it, not just the mammoths and mastodons and sloths that came down to get a drink of water, but there was an active living community in the lake. And these are the bones of the most common animal that was found. And yes, that is a staple for scale. And what this is we have a huge collection of bones of tiger salamander. There was a very healthy population of salamanders in this lake for a very long time. And in fact, what's really interesting is we see three different developmental stages in the salamanders. So we've got the full-grown adults. We have the neotenic axolotls, there where the adults retain the gills, and there's actually a cannibalistic form. And we know that those three forms are predominant in the populations depending on water temperature. So these salamanders are our paleothermometers as we look at the different layers where they come from and which form we have to tell us something about changing water temperature in this lake over the period of time when these fossils were washing in and being accumulated. But we didn't stop there. We got birds. There's a little beak in the upper left-hand corner of a little finch-like animal, a bird wing bone there. We got shrews. We got rabbits. We didn't get much in the way of carnivores. The otter is one of the few carnivore bones that we got. Lots of different mice, different types of voles, chipmunks, and that. So there is, right now we've got about 35 different species of vertebrates that have come out of the site between the large animals and the small animals. But that's not all. We got more than that. I mentioned the peat deposit. We've got plant material. So you can see the cattail leaves preserved in the peat there. So we've got paleobotanists involved in the project. We've got beetle parts preserved, and you can see it still has the original pigments and colors in it. So we had an expert on Pleistocene beetles working on the beetles from the site. We've got snails from the site. There's something for everybody. And I said, yes, we had wood from the site. We had spruce logs, we had fir logs, we had pine logs. And so we basically here, part of excavating the site was excavating around all these logs. And once they dried out, you could burn them like wood, despite the fact that some of them were from 130,000 at the bottom to about 40,000 up in the peat layer. So we've got 90,000 years of time represented, and throughout that we've got these logs that fell down, rolled into the lake, and are preserved there. And if you think collecting mammoths is hard, try collecting spruce logs. Well, fortunately the botanists were not crazy, and so they brought out a chainsaw. So they too were taking log sections, and so to do tree ring studies. So there's a phenomenal amount of wood that was collected at the site. Here is the beach. This is the beach deposit along this Ice Age leg. You can see all the logs they uncovered. And intermixed amongst these logs are mastodon bones that had died along the beach. And if you pay close attention to some of those logs, there's all kinds of details. Gnaw marks. What chews on wood? Beavers. We never really found any beaver bones, but we know they were there. But wouldn't it be neat that somewhere in that 90% of unexcavated lake, we found a Pleistocene beaver lodge? It's a possibility. Who knows what's out there? So trace fossils. If you're interested in trace fossils, we had them. And here's a really spectacular trace fossil with this log. And you can see these insect galleries here. And if you've been paying attention to the news the last few years in Colorado, we've been having trouble with bark beetle infestations. Well, the bark beetles have been around for at least 130,000 years. And each type of bark beetle has a distinctive gallery pattern. So we figure we should be able to figure out what beetle made this. And Scott Elias, who was doing the Pleistocene beetles, and gave us a fauna list. He says, this is what we've got parts of for the following beetles. And so we had this one, Hylastes nigrinus. And here is a modern example of the galleries it makes. And you can see, well, it doesn't match up. So these galleries weren't made by Hylastes. Or the spruce beetle, Scolytes, you can see that its pattern is quite different as well. And those were the two types of bark beetles that we actually had the body fossils from recovered from the peat that we expected to make the gallery here. So we're scratching our heads, and I found somebody who said, oh, I know somebody who's an expert on beetle galleries. They do forestry work and stuff like that. We sent him a picture, and he said, oh, that's real easy. What you've got is an Ips beetle. There's 11 species in Colorado today. We don't know which one we had, but you can see the gallery pattern is very, very similar, where the eggs were laid, they hatched in the pupa and then dug through the bark and that. But we never got any body remains of the Ips beetle. And the Ips beetle doesn't kill live trees. It feeds on trees after they're already down. So that was kind of an interesting. So we've got a beetle that we only know from the gallery patterns in its wood. So this has really been one of those great detective forensic stories of lots of different evidence coming in from lots of different sources. And we even got spruce cones amongst the plant material that was preserved there. And this is part of a master's thesis, and it turns out that this is an extinct variety of white spruce. We often don't think of plants going extinct in the Pleistocene extinctions, but in the West we lost a type of white spruce, which is intriguing. And this was all tied together because we brought in folks from the USGS who had been working in the area, knew the general geology, and so they very precisely worked out the stratigraphic sequences, the sedimentology, and really gave us a framework to tie this whole story together. So this is really the ultimate partnership of many, many different disciplines coming together. And while I've talked about all these animals together, the really interesting story is that what type of animals you get low in the section, 130,000 years from when the glacier came in, pushed over that ridge, left that moraine deposits and formed the lake, is we get the Sangamonian interglacial, the last interglacial. So the Bull Lake glaciation has pulled back, it's warmed up, and this is where we find the megalonyx, the giant bison, and the mastodon, stratigraphically low down in the deposit here. And as you go up and get into the Wisconsin, the last glaciation, it starts getting cooler up in the Rocky Mountains. Then we start getting our mammoths and our camels and our horses and other animals. So we actually see a change in what animals are present in the site with the stratigraphic layer tied to the cooling of the environment. And we also find that some of these bones got out into the deposits as part of debris flows. So there were probably heavy rains, the ground got saturated, a lot of this moraine material just sloughed off and washed bones down out into the lake and added to their preservation. So we do find a number of debris flows, and then eventually what do lakes do? They fill in, they silt in, and it became a marsh, and that's when we got our peat deposit forming, and then eventually it got capped over with the clay that finished it off. So just to recap our story here at Snowmass, we've got our lake left behind by the moraine. We have a mammoth that decides it wants to make a contribution to the fossil record. A debris flow pushes it down into the water. We have a little bit more sedimentation. Eventually it fills up where it's shallow enough that a mammoth could actually walk out into the marshy area if it wanted to. And that, of course, he decides that he wants to contribute to the fossil record as well. And that's our peat mammoth that was found that we thought perhaps might have been killed by people. Dating of the peat is around 40,000 years, so way, way earlier than the earliest people. And given the fact that we know that there's lots of debris flow, we think that perhaps those rocks that were found with it were not possibly brought in by people, but could have been other rocks that were sloughing off the sides of this basin and getting out there. This would have been frozen in the wintertime, rock could have slid across the ice, and then eventually when it melted in the spring, settled in. Still an ongoing debate. I'm not saying I've got the final answer. We've come up with a lot of great stories, but we don't necessarily agree on the interpretation on all of them. And then, of course, eventually our nice bulldozer people stop and find material for us and call in the museum. So what we're looking at here is we know during the Pleistocene, we went from warm periods to cold periods. There was a lot of fluctuations. And here we are at about 130,000 at the tail end of the Bull Lake glaciation. We go into the warming period. We have our lake here. And then we start here going down into the Wisconsin end. So basically the period of time that we've got represented there at Snowmass is about 90,000 years. That captures most of the Sangamonian interglacial. And if we look at that, these are all the known sites that have been placed in the Sangamonian. It's not a bad sample, but it's certainly not as large as, say, the other sites in the Wisconsin, and they're much younger. And once again, in terms of being able to look at Snowmass, it's the highest elevation Sangamonian site, so it gives us some insight and understanding of what's going on compared to some of these on the plains and along the coast and elsewhere. So it's certainly going to become a major Rosetta Stone, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of getting a better handle on the Sangamonian interglacial. So here we have our glacier pushing over the side, creating this kettle at the Bull Lake. It warms up into the Sangamonian. Our sloth, our bison, our mastodon, some of our other animals are enjoying the good life in the high country. As time passes and it starts cooling off, our little lake is filling up, becoming marshy, and we're seeing a change in what animals are living up there in terms of the mammoth and the camel and the horse and the animals that are a little bit more cold tolerant. And then, of course, we move into Pleistocene time, or to the Holocene, the Ziegler family homesteads. They kind of modify this in order to be their water supply for their homestead till it's purchased by the city of Snowmass, who decides they need more water and starts our operations here in terms of pulling this story together. But it's really important to remember that this is a real interdisciplinary project. These are all of the different institutions that have participated or have researchers involved with it. So I may be conveying the story, but I'm pulling together the information from a lot of different people, experts in their own disciplines who've all contributed to it. And one of the nice things is that an issue of quaternary research has said that they will dedicate a whole volume to Snowmass. We've all written our papers and submitted it. So we are looking forward to, hopefully by the end of this year, early next year, to have the first set of major papers come out on the Snowmass site. But of course, the science doesn't end there. All of us have spin-off projects we're going to be doing, and so Snowmass is going to continue to be showing up in the scientific literature, I think, for a long time to come, in terms of looking at what we understand about the ecology of the fauna, climate change, and what was going on in the Rocky Mountains during the Pleistocene. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you get any deciduous logs in the Sangamonian or anywhere to
all of the logs that they've identified so far have been spruce, fir, and pine. So if there were any deciduous trees up there, they haven't identified them yet. But it's also possibly at that high elevation, any of the deciduous trees, say like aspen, are going to be a smaller diameter. And so it may be that they just haven't looked at all the smaller diameter logs yet. But a lot of the deciduous trees up there are going to be smaller and not going to be quite as obvious. But there is the pollen work, and we are seeing some pollen that's suggesting there are deciduous trees up there. But like I say, aspen and things like that, that you would find in the area today.
It's a pretty diverse fauna.
It is. It's
Just conifers.
yeah. Yes?
Is anyone doing isotope work, like oxygen isotopes on any of the boats?
A lot of the folks at the USGS are doing that. And then Dan Fisher is sectioning the mastodon tusks and is doing isotope work on the mastodon tusks. And that includes looking at oxygen isotopes as well. So it'll be very interesting to see what pattern he gets in terms of climatic signals comparing the mastodons from the mammoths in the two different stratigraphic levels. So in that regard, that's one of the contributions that Dan's making to the project. Yeah.
When you encourage your friends in Wyoming and New Mexico to find similar sites, what type of geographical features are you telling them to look for?
I'm basically saying look for what look like ancient lakes. So sort of circular features, or, and not all lakes are circular, some are going to be irregular. But just, if you are doing field work and you're looking at aerial photos, does this meadow look like it might possibly have been a lake that filled in? So it's in many ways it's kind of just giving them a hard time. But on the other hand, I think it's one of those things that if you give people a search image and you get them thinking about it, that when they run across something, suddenly go, well, maybe perhaps this is what it is. So like I say, totally independently, my friend in New Mexico got this site that was found by the Forest Service. They were putting in a road, they cut through, and bones showed up, so they called the museum, and now he's excavating. And obviously he hasn't found a sloth yet, but he's well aware of my interest that if one should show up, I'd like to be known about it. So really, it's just kind of saying we've got this evidence from Snowmass that there was these lakes. They were probably major water holes. Animals were coming down and utilizing them as a water source. Keep that in mind. Yes?
Did you say there were juvenile megalonyx at the site?
Yes. We have the back end of a brain case of one animal that the sutures aren't fused, and it looks like. It's probably comparable to your middle-aged juveniles, not as young as the toddler from Tarkio, but it's probably in approximately the same age range as the youngster from Tarkio.
Was it in any kind of association with the adults?
No. If you plot up where you got where the adult came from, you've got a nice concentration of bones, and the juveniles were elsewhere and at different stratigraphic levels.
So are we still allowed to say that we have the only site that has?
Oh, absolutely. Well,
That's what
only site where you've got juveniles with definite association with the adults,
Just making sure.
and that certainly.
Not that it's a competition.
Right. Well, yeah, I like to have your bragging rights. I appreciate that. Yeah.
So of all the things that you have found and excite you, what is the biggest surprise? And the flip side, has there been a disappointment?
Well, I can't say I found it, but in terms of all the things I've had a chance to work on, probably one of the most interesting is some sloth material from Peru that was collected by a colleague of mine that turned out to be an aquatically adapted sloth. So we have an evolutionary lineage of sloths that that adapted to a marine environment. And my friend worked on whales, seals, sea lions. He was working in this marine deposit, and then they find their complete articulated skeletons of this sloth as well. And it Turns out if you look at its anatomy and that, it was aquatically adapted. So in terms of the really most unusual, totally unexpected that I've worked on in collaboration with my colleague Christian de Mouzon, it would be the aquatic sloth. It's really hard to say what's the most disappointing, because working in a museum or working for the Park Service, a lot of people come in and ask to have bones identified. Holmes knows this on a regular basis. And I have occasionally had somebody talk me into coming out to the site, and what they thought was a bone was a rock or a misidentification. But that's part and parcel. And you never know when somebody reports something and you follow up on it, that you hit a really phenomenal site like Snowmass. So, you know, it's like anything. If you're willing to throw the dice once in a while, occasionally it will pay off.